Hi and welcome back. As usual, you can just put your headphones in, but you can also watch the video. I am going to add some footage and some references over the video. This is Maia. Can you introduce yourself? And oh yeah, just before I forget it, this podcast is going to be about the yoga to anti-science pipeline. And what is that and who are you?
Hi everybody, my name is Maia Kahlke Lorenzen. I'm part of a research collective called Alma, and I work with researching online subcultures, online extremism, and I also train people on digital self-defense and how to protect themselves against online harassment. And then I've also done, especially since I does a lot of research into conspiracy theories and how people kind of tend to fall into these different types of online rabbit holes.
And one of these online rabbit holes is people who used to be interested in yoga, well they still are, but specifically people who do yoga do have a tendency to also believe a lot of conspiracy theories, to fall a lot into the conspiracy theory. Can you tell a bit more about what has been happening the past few years with yoga and the pipeline to conspiracy theories?
Absolutely. I think it's important to understand that kind of yoga is not just doing yoga. There's often a whole environment around it that and I used to do a lot of yoga myself. Now I don't have time anymore because I have small kids, but I would go and do yoga, but there's also all these little statues of different Hindu deities, but then you also have some Buddhist mantras, and you kind of mix and match this spirituality into it, and there are some crystals and some oils, so you kind of go into this kind of spiritual environment, which is not strictly connected to any specific type of religion, but it's kind of mix and match spirituality borrowed from the East and kind of spread out to Western women in particular. And I think that that environment also kind of glorifies this idea that you do this yoga, it's good for your body, but you also open up your mind. They also often talk about when you're at a yoga class, open your third eye and be open to the possibilities. So you have this kind of connection between the act of doing yoga as an exercise to this kind of spiritual awakening practice that has its roots in the 60s and 70s kind of hippie movement, where you also started seeing these kind of mix and match spiritualism in Western countries.
Did you ever notice the anti-science aspect of it before, or do you think that's something that has come in the past couple of years?
No, I definitely noticed it.
Yeah.
I remember actually being at a yoga class once, and of course this is anecdotal, so this is not to say, but I remember the yoga teachers going and then you feel your hip bone does this, and there was a woman in the class coughing. She's like, no, that's not possible.
What did she say that the hip bone should do?
It should bend backwards, something where she was like, I know that you probably mean this metaphorically, but what you're saying it's not you don't oxygenize your blood or whatever the yoga instructor said, and it was oh, it doesn't matter, it's just a metaphor. But there's this kind of this lightness around what is actually happening to your body, and there's also this tendency in yoga and also other kind of connected wellness combined with spiritual practices to kind of oversell the benefits to your body. So they'll say yoga is good for you. And yes, it's good.
It is good.
It's good for you. It's great exercise. I got rid of my neck pain by doing yoga. It's really great. But then it's well, actually, yoga can cure your diseases. And then you're
overselling.
Yeah, exactly. So there's this tendency in this kind of self-help wellness milieu to oversell both the physical exercise, but also the products that are often connected, like the essential oils will do this to you, and they'll give you some oils this will open up your heart chakra, and that's good against menstrual pains or cramps or whatever. You're so you get these kind of alternative explanations for the different things that they sell. Maybe some will also sell different types of food products or teas, and it's these things do these things, and you have a lot of you pull in some history from natural medicine where some herbs are good for you, but then you start kind of mix and matching and overselling them on what they do.
Overselling them, yeah, definitely.
And overselling the impact on your body, and also just sometimes making up. I feel this tea is good against whatever, and then that is a proven fact.
Yeah.
Or often as it is, like I tried to drink this tea, and that meant I got rid of my menstrual cramps. So now I'm going to make it and sell it, and I'll say this works against menstrual cramps because that happened to me. But that's again,
it's an anecdote.
It's an anecdote.
And also we don't know what's also really interesting. We don't always know if two things happen at the same time. They're not necessarily
exactly.
What's it called?
It's like
there's not a causation.
A correlation is not causation, and that is very much what's happening in these environments too. It's like I'm seeing. So, for instance, that happened a lot during Corona. Like you had maybe a group of friends, and they all reported this thing happening to them after the vaccine. You're like, oh, that must be how the vaccine works. But it's like that is not, a statistically significant sample. Just because your friends experience something doesn't mean that that's what everybody experiences. But I think there's very much this tendency to kind of, look inwards, feel your truth. There's also this tendency to glorify. In Danish you say like mavefornemmelse, it's gut feeling. It's like when your gut feeling tells you that this is good for you, then it must be good for everybody, and that's very unscientific.
And also you really have to think about the thing with correlations and causation, because I have brown hair and it's windy outside right now. And but isn't it windy because I have brown hair? In that way you can find the link between a lot of stuff that doesn't necessarily have a link. Maybe things just happen at the same time.
Exactly, and it's really interesting. This very infamous Danish study that said it's really healthy to drink red wine, and people were like, great, let's drink some red wine. But they found out that the sample was very for people who drank a lot of red wine tended to be richer. So if you have more money, then you're more likely to have good health. So it's also like drinking wine was a marker of class. It doesn't mean that the wine is what makes you healthy.
No, but it happens to be a component of their lifestyle.
Exactly.
And we don't know, maybe they would have been even healthier if they didn't drink.
Exactly. You could also say wearing expensive cashmere sweaters make you healthy, or living in a big house, expensive house will make you healthy. It's like, maybe it's the other way around. But no, so there's definitely this yoga sits in this kind of whole culture of wellness and self-help and semi-spirituality. You don't have to buy in and get the t-shirt and call yourself a Buddhist to be to be in the yoga community, but maybe you mix and match some kind of spirituality and kind of take a little bit from India and maybe a little bit from Thailand without really knowing its origins.
What really fits in there.
Exactly. And then you're like, there's also this tendency, it's like, well, this is Eastern medicine, so this is good for you, but without really knowing what you're actually,
what you're actually doing.
What are you actually eating?
And one thing we also have to talk about is, Eastern medicine, whatever that is, also has promoted itself and has branded itself. So it's also branding. It's also but this is kind of a hard one because that's a story for another episode.
That's the story. I think the whole fetishization and lack of understanding of Eastern medicine, and I say that with quotation marks, in the West is a chapter in itself. But definitely there's this thing to be to kind of make up your own things and pretend that it's natural medicine from another part of the world, but it's not really. And
even if it is, doesn't mean that it works. And what we also have to think about here is also the appeal to nature, that whenever something is natural, it is better. But if I take some bark and shove it in my ear, is it then better than taking painkillers if I have a headache? Well, probably not. And it's also it's hard to, where do you draw the line between nature and culture? So natural is not always better. If I go outside and sleep in hurricane weather, is that better for me? Probably not. Then it's maybe better I have a house with electricity and
But that's so unnatural though.
Yeah, it's so unnatural.
But you're absolutely, that is so on point what you just said, because there's this in these communities there's this dichotomy between nature and culture, and culture is bad, Like you want something to be as natural as possible. And like you say, sometimes our bodies naturally, or like they, you know, for instance, when they become sick, you know, that's nature, but then it's nice to have, for instance, a medical system or a doctor who can help you or prescribe medicine. And there's always been a skepticism of that in these communities as well. It's like, well, you know, this is both from like a legitimate concern with the pharmaceutical industry, which has like very bad histories of experimentation and not being open about what's in their medicine and so on. So I think there's a legitimate concern, but then that legitimate concern kind of, you know,
it takes over into, you know, we need a legitimate concern and skepticism for everything basically, but if it takes over 100%, you know, then it really becomes a problem.
Exactly, and then you start talking about big pharma with capital letters, and you know, thinking that everything that comes from, you know, health authorities or the pharmaceutical industry or any kind of licensed doctor is in itself like bad, and they're out to get you, and then it becomes kind of conspirational. So there's been a tendency to be like, oh well, you should try like natural remedies and teas and oil and exercise and different types of food rather than going to the doctor and rather than getting painkillers or medicine. There's been a tendency to that, but I think it really took off in the 90s with the like modern anti-vax movement, and definitely during Corona it's kind of escalated a lot. So there's been a lot of kind of radicalization from this kind of yoga community into like anti-science, being actually anti-science, not just being like, you know, I'm a bit more into herbal teas than painkillers, but like, no, you should not get don't get cancer treatment, just do essential oils, and like basically mistrusting the whole of like the foundations of modern medicine.
And it is kind of sad because, like, I mean, if they never developed, you know, if we never developed all the medicine, all the hospitals, you know, that would be kind of sad that we spent the last thousands of years not really doing anything.
Yeah.
None of it is like, you know,
but I also think
it's useful.
And it's also interesting, this whole like, you know, the natural lifespan of people before we invented like soap and different types of medicine. Like also the idea that, you know, we've had those systems in place for quite a long time. Like we wouldn't have a very long life expectancy.
No.
And then of course, you know, we can talk about what should it be in order to have a good quality of life and so on. But this this idea of throwing all of, you know, modern medicine and help of doctors and medications out completely and going back to just eating some sort of powder or using an essential oil is like taking it to the extremes.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I do get some of the natural stuff, like it makes sense in terms of don't drink battery acid, but like if my leg is broken, it doesn't help me to like take a cucumber and like tape it on my leg, because that's natural. Like then maybe just like go and have a cast, what is it called? The thing you put on a broken leg, you know.
And I think that actually comes back to another tendency that I think is important in this kind of self-help development environment that yoga is also part of. It's the idea that you don't recognize, you know, official experts. They're kind of the system, and the system is bad, but you recognize like kind of strange quacks and grifters, and maybe a yoga teacher who doesn't have a formal education, but if they'll tell you that no, like don't do what they say, just like drink this tea or strip this cucumber to your leg or whatever, then you're more inclined to believe them. And that's where the kind of conspirational thinking comes in as well.
And what I think is really interesting there, because I looked at a lot of like these conspirational anti-science people, is that they always want to sell something, or the sale is at the end of their scheme, because first of all they make you afraid of something that you shouldn't be afraid of, or that has some legitimate concern. For instance, like people sometimes do get overprescribed painkillers, and then they get like a headache from taking painkillers every single day. I'm not saying don't take painkillers, and some people do need them every day, but sometimes maybe doctors could be more attentive and look into the root cause instead of just prescribing painkillers.
There's an opioid crisis in the US. I mean, there is definitely overprescription happening. But like you say, it's like going overboard. And when the conspiration comes in, it's like when you take the legitimate criticism of this, and then instead of seeing like, okay, that's a flawed system, and there's definitely also some like big financial interests in doing this, but it's also to a large extent also a flawed system, then you see, no, it's a conspiracy. Somebody's driving this and they're doing it on purpose, and they're trying to kind of control us and get it under their thumb. And that's where I found that I saw some really scary developments during Corona here in Denmark, mainly where I'm looking, but I think this is a tendency I can see happening elsewhere as well. It's like, it's where a lot of these kind of yogi self-help communities turn from being skeptic, maybe not everybody would their kids, but some would, but you didn't make it a big part of your life or your personality, going from that to suddenly being like hardcore anti and also mistrusting not just the medical system but the whole political system is like out to get you. And like you say, it's definitely not just happening, it's also being driven by a lot of people who have something to sell.
And yeah, what I find is like interesting, you don't go to the professionals in the hospital who can be wrong, like not all doctors are good, like unfortunately, but I do think that they're more good than a random person on the internet who then in the end always would say, or your yoga teacher would say, but then you can buy this tea from me and it's not even that expensive.
That's the thing, like most of these influencers, whether they're online or most of them are online by now, but they will have something to sell. They'll be like, don't take the medicine or just do these yoga poses in this oil instead of getting cancer treatment and I can sell you the oils. And there was some research done into anti-tweets by a Danish research team, and they also found that the biggest like spreaders of misinformation about vaccines were people who sold alternative medicine on their own websites. So they have this narrative like it's the big pharma and they want to sell you for money, and you're like, but you know, you're literally selling like weird cures on your online website.
That reminds me of an anecdote, but I feel like it's like, I don't know, it really encapsulates all of this like anti-science yoga stuff. So I was in a shop and this lady said, have you had your shot yet? And I just ignored her because I kind of knew where it was going, so I walked away. And then another woman was like, no, I haven't. I'm going to. And she was like, oh, but you shouldn't trust them. She was like, oh, it's unnatural. And she was like, okay. So she was listening, and I was just like listening in the background. And then she says, so my cousin had the shot, and then something bad happened to her. Then she got really ill, and she was like, oh, okay, so that's anecdotal. So just because it happens to someone doesn't mean it's gonna happen to everyone. And then she was like, yeah, but luckily I heard of this thing, this beluga honey or something, beluga honey, and you could take that instead. And she was like, oh, okay. So you can find it on my page, and it's not even that expensive.
So she's just like hanging around the pharmacies and waiting for people who've gotten their shot to sell them yoga, sell them honey?
It was in like a clothing shop.
Okay.
So she was just like talking to people. So, but the thing is with influencers, they often have an affiliate link. I have affiliate links. So every time I sell something, like for me, it's like selling this podcast app, which I feel like it's just a podcast app. So it's like more I don't feel like it's wrong. But I mean, I do earn money every time people like get a subscription, you know. So and also did it with other stuff. But it's not like when an influencer recommends something. You shouldn't trust that they really recommend it. They do earn money from it. So
absolutely, that's the whole problem with, and that's also why it's the legislation, at least in Denmark, that you have to say if it's sponsored. So you know if it's like a recommendation that you get paid for. But I think that's definitely the driver. Like the wellness industry in itself is huge, like $1 billion industry that sells you like food supplements and beluga honey and you know, whatever. And then the yoga industry itself is also like...
I have it written down here. Let me see. The contemporary yoga is a $18 billion global industry.
but that is also huge. And then you have all the stuff that surrounds it. It's like, you know, you have the yoga and the clothes, but there's also the connection of like you selling crystals and essential oils, and maybe you'll start like eating vegan food, which you'll buy from these special shops, or you'll get all these superfoods that are so popular, like, you know, seaweed and goji berries, and of course you buy them from these like special natural shops and so on. So there's like a whole connected wellness industry around it, where often they will sell you this stuff based on like not based on science. Like it's often not scientifically proven. Of course, it's never bad for you to eat more vegetables and food
vegetables
that is
are always
less processed.
Good.
That's great.
But it depends on how like what people mean with processed, because it's a long. That's a long discussion. Because oatmeal, it's processed. Like if it wasn't processed, you couldn't eat it. Would you want to drink milk that's not processed and like have the risks? You know, so processed milk is good because then we don't want. So it's a long story for another episode.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's that's also like where the anti-science comes in. And then there's also another thing which I found was interesting that a friend of mine told me, who's a yoga teacher, and said that there's also this tendency to kind of strive for a specific type of mindset. That, you know, you have to be open to the world, you have to like, you know, you have to open your like third eye and be like open to new impressions and like open to your intuition and, you know, your gut feeling. And in connection and balance with yourself. So there's also this, it's an environment where there's kind of a lot of softness and not a lot of conflict. So she specifically said, like, you know, when people started inviting me to like these rallies, you don't say like, no, I'm not going to do that. It's like you meet people like, that's interesting, and that's like this glorification of like openness and curiosity, which is great, and like and friendliness and kind of, you know, radiating this calm, like enlightened spirit, and that both mean that you're more likely to just like consume when somebody you trust brings something to you, like, oh, that's interesting, and I'll look it up. But this kind of idea of being and becoming enlightened is also like language that is very seen a lot in anti-science conspiracy communities. Like they talk about being awake, for instance, and you're asleep if you don't understand it, and the rest are sheep, and we in here, in this group, are the enlightened, and we know things that not everybody else knows. So there's both this like, it can have like a cultish tendency sometimes, but also this idea of like being the one in the know also is a nice position. Like that makes you a little bit better and more enlightened than the rest of the people who haven't understood your truth.
But I also feel like it's a little judgy, because sometimes when I've encountered these people, like I'm not mad at anyone for not getting the shot. It's not like where I'm getting at. It's not my point. But sometimes when I don't agree or when I just say, oh, okay, then they get mad and they're like, you are a sheep, and then that's not very open.
No, that's the interesting thing. I think it's very much like it's a self-image, like that's what you want to be and that's what you want to radiate, and that's how you see yourself. But you also get angry at the sheep, especially like maybe before lockdown, you could live in these kind of enlightened bubbles and it would be fine. But because we had a lockdown and these people were like had their movements impaired by different types of legislations in all different types of countries, then suddenly it was in conflict. Like you can't just stay in your own little bubble. Suddenly they had their movements restricted by something that they feel is not true. Like they don't believe we had a pandemic, for instance. And then they get aggressive, and the people like you and me who are like, no, obviously we had a pandemic, they think that like we are actually part of, like now they see us more as part of the conspiracy. It's like you're actively conspiring to make this up, so you, in order to restrict my movements, like you don't want to wake up and see the truth, because suddenly, like it actually, like our disagreement is actually limiting their ability to live their lives the way they want to do it.
So what I've also read about and what I've noticed is that women have a tendency to go more into yoga, unfortunately, and more into anti-science. Lately, I've seen also men do this in a different way, but then it's more just like meat diets and stuff like that.
That's a whole nother episode.
That's a whole nother
onion juice, meat diets, bone broth.
I did not know about the onion juice.
Liver King.
Why did you tell me about onion juice?
It increases testosterone. It doesn't. It doesn't increase testosterone, but some men on 4chan were promoting eating, like drinking onion juice to increase testosterone levels.
I can get that, I picture out of my head like that taste. Wow, okay. So onion juice, no. So women, what I have noticed and why I think that is like the science community often tends to be a bit mean towards women, and then I think like when women meet these nice little yoga ladies, these nice other women who are really nice to them, really accepting, really inviting, then they tend to go and meet up with them, go and listen to them, trust them, because as a woman who's interested in science, also really interested in training, I used to also study to be a trainer, then I stopped. So the whole environment, it is very sometimes there's too much, how do I say this? Too much focus on the facts and not as much focus on how people feel.
Yeah.
So it's a lot you should just do this and this and this, but it's not a very inviting space, especially for women who are often talked down to, who are often they're not really, nobody really listens to them, and they're not seen as physically capable or as smart, or it's always the boys can lift this, or the boys must know something about this. So as a woman, you're often talked down to, and there's this assumed incompetence.
And I think especially in the medical system and sciences, women have been under-researched. And also, for instance, looking at something like endometriosis, which has only recently become a diagnosis, because women have been complaining about these debilitating pains forever, and a lot of male doctors it's supposed to hurt when you have your period. You're just being oversensitive. Yeah. And the amount of pain that people are in when they have endometriosis is hardcore, right? So I think there's a lot of very valid skepticism from a lot of women who've tried to go to the doctor and be yeah, sure, you're sick.
So this connection between hippies and spirituality and anti-science and conspiracy theories, it is new. Can you tell me a bit more about how it was used in Germany in the 20s and 30s?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So it's pretty interesting that when you dig a little into how where the Nazi Party actually took their inspiration, they had quite a lot of inspiration from the folkish movements, which were looking back into German heritage and also old pagan traditions, and very much had this body culture where you had to they glorified fit and naked bodies and eating healthy and staying fit and going into nature, and all these things that you don't tend to necessarily combine with Nazis, because they've been pinned these aggressive war types, but before that they also had this whole what was considered a healthy people, very much looked back into historical roots and also glorified German nature and people's connection to the soil and the plants and so on. And also Hitler had a whole group of occultists that he consulted. They loved that shit. They really loved the whole occult thing. Which is also very, very interesting, and consulted horoscopes and so on. So there are some tenets of the fascism and Nazi ideologies of that period that you can see in modern hippie movements as well. And also Hitler was a vegetarian and cared a lot about animal rights and so on. So you have this thing Nazis are evil, so they everything with them was evil, but
they hit the kittens.
Exactly. They hit the kittens, but they also glorified a lot of things that are still glorified in a lot of cultures today. So I think that's also why some people are sometimes surprised that these yoga teachers and hippies end up in far-right conspiracies like QAnon, but like fascist movements have always like glorified, you know, the natural order, natural and fit bodies, nature. Like you have a lot of, like, for instance, modern like eco-fascist movements where it's like returning to nature. You've also seen in Denmark like far-right groups who like turn up at nature cleanups and try and recruit people there. And like, for instance, the Christchurch terrorist had a whole manifesto with a lot of pictures of New Zealand nature, like returning to your roots and your nature. So like the obsession with nature and natural states is very much a fascist tenet, but also the obsession with aesthetics and body aesthetics. And that is something that is also very present in yoga communities. Like if you're not skinny and fit, you're less likely to feel welcome in a lot of yoga spaces. So there is that like glorification of like a specific type of physical aesthetic that is also very much embedded in also in modern fascist movements. So it's not so strange that you can go that way.
Can you explain a bit more about the eco-fascism?
Yeah, so the eco-fascism, so there are like two different types of interpretations actually. So you can both be like, a fascist in the sense that you're willing to subscribe to a totalitarian ideology in order to kind of rebalance nature. So you'd be like, we need eugenics, we need population control in order to like mitigate climate change. But then you can also have like eco-fascism, which is a fascist movement that kind of derives their identity from the nature that you're born in. So you kind of see some, like for instance, white supremacists from Sweden who like fashion themselves out in the woods, and they're like, this is where I belong, and I don't mind people from other places. They just should stay and be connected to the land like that they grew out of. So like you take your fascism also like very much from the nature and the land around you. You kind of fetishize that, just like the Christchurch terrorist did. It's like going back to some kind of glorious past and the blood and the soil, right, the land. But also it's also an anti-modernity tendency, because a lot of people are, and understandably, very alienated with like the way modern cities are made and the way we have to work and how we eat and how we live. And then they can look to like they have a big modernity critique, but their answer is kind of like, go live in the woods in little cabins and kick the invaders out, basically. That's also like a tenet of that type of eco-fascism.
And also, what's really interesting, I need to touch on what I read in the material that you sent me. The people who are most likely to believe in one conspiracy are also more likely to believe in another, although if these conspiracies are like total opposites.
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting.
It's so interesting, and the interesting thing, that's what's so interesting about conspiracy like QAnon, and I don't know if we can say it without you getting shadow banned on YouTube. So like, that conspiracy theory has really like perfectioned connecting all of the conspiracy
it's a lot of
theories.
different ones. Like I tried to connect all of them. I don't know if I ever sent that to you, but it was like something with like Hillary Clinton, exactly, pizza in a bathtub with pizza.
But that's the thing, we laugh about it, but it's also so like serious, because it means that suddenly we live in a society with people who are where my reality is completely decoupled from theirs. It's like, I can be like, you don't seriously believe that, but to me they're like, you don't seriously believe what they've told you your whole life. And you see, in Denmark we've seen like old like hippie communists and like yoga moms and football hooligans and far-right influencers, like all kind of being swept up in these like pandemic conspiracy theories and then like cross-pollinating with each other's conspiracy theories. So it's like, I can totally believe that if you're already primed to believe in one conspiracy theory, then you're more likely to be, oh yeah, that's right, of course, they also pollute our drinking water and they're also after your kids, or because then you already have that kind of mindset. And I also read that you do something called, I think it's called epopenia, where you see connections where there aren't necessarily any, like you see patterns. So for instance, if a number is significant to you, like number 8 is the code
Mm.
for something, then you'll start noticing number 8 everywhere. And then you'll think there's a pattern, but actually it's a pattern in your brain that means you notice stuff that you give significance to. So for instance, if you're pissed off that there's so many there are so many annoying people with prams all over the city, then suddenly you'll notice them. But if you don't think about them, it's not because there are more, it's because you pay more attention to it.
Yeah.
And that really plays into kind of diving into a conspiracy theory. Suddenly you're seeing like, oh, everything's connected, all the patterns. And of course, a lot of that also means that a lot of really smart people end up in conspiracy theory communities, because you have that knack for seeing the patterns. And sometimes there are patterns, like there are like genuine conspiracies from pharmaceutical companies to test like birth control pills on poor women, or the Tuskegee experiments, or in Denmark, the Tuskegee experiments on black men, for instance. Or in Denmark we had like Thule Basin, where the US were allowed to where they flew prisoners of war in and out through Danish territory, and the politicians didn't tell us. We had Tamil Sane in the 80s, where people fleeing from a civil war didn't get asylum, and it was like a political scandal, and it was covered up. So we have real life conspiracies to cover things up, and sometimes they come to light, and it's good. But that mindset where you're suddenly everything is a conspiracy, that can also you said before, it can kind of flip, and suddenly you don't trust anything because sometimes the media gets it wrong, or they don't report accurately, and sometimes the politicians cover stuff up, and suddenly you're all they do is cover up, all the media does is lie, all the health system is trying to get you sick, and then it kind of flips.
But it's often more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
I mean, of course you should always be critical, or as much as you can, but sometimes you can become critical about everything and everyone, and suddenly everyone is evil, everything is bad, and that's also not a great way to live your life.
No, I think it's really impossible to live your life, and then you go live in a cabin in the woods being hyper paranoid about everybody. So, and I think that's where it's also when you're a critical person, right? You're critical of the established system. That's also where it's a fine balance, right? Because you need to point out the flaws in the system, and sometimes there are massive
there are flaws,
yes.
I mean,
and
I'm
sometimes there are
annoyed with
real
modernity as well, and
yeah.
I'm also annoyed with it does annoy me that it's a concrete jungle in the cities. Often there's no nature. I mean, that's not great, but it doesn't make nature itself as a concept better. A, because you can't define it. B, even if you could define it the way it's commonly defined, do we want to go so far back where life expectancy is 1.5 years or something?
Yeah, exactly. Or where if you have if you're giving birth, there's a high risk of dying in childbirth, and if the harvest was bad, you'd starve, and so on. I think there's this glorification of ancient history, which was also really hard lives.
So looking back at yoga and fascism, I think what's really interesting, because I've read an article, I'm going to post it underneath down below, about two English officers who were in India as part of the imperial forces, could you call them that? I think you can. And they used yoga to redefine themselves and redefine their own masculinity. So they were both very weak and not very a military man while they were in yoga. But when they came back to England, they started writing books talking about yoga as what made them the masculine man, and how it made their bodies fit. And they used it to rewrite their own story, their own history, and used it to rewrite their own maleness. And then through that and other stuff, yoga and this idea of yoga, it spilled into the rest of society. And one of these, he was, as I could understand, pretty attractive, so women listened a lot to him and looked at him. And he also heavily influenced them, but they were both fascists. So although yoga on the one hand is used as something that's soft and very much seen as something that women like and that women benefit from, it can also be used, and has for a long time been used, as something that's masculine, as something that's like hard, and something that's like focused on a visual and bodily culture.
Absolutely. And I think it's also interesting, we talked about like women getting into these spaces and meeting other understanding women, but the truth is also that a lot of yoga teachers and like yoga gurus are men who teach women, like the Bikram yoga thing, for instance.
He was the one who was like grouping them, right?
Beyond that, yeah, but it's like you often have these men who do these very impressive things, and then like, you know, women who take their courses and so on. Because it's interesting, it's not, there are definitely like men in the yoga communities, but it's like very female coded by now.
I would say it's very, very female coded.
Yeah.
But what I think is interesting with both yoga and fascism, and I'm not mad at people for doing yoga, I'm not saying people who do yoga are fascists, because I know that's going to be a comment, because every time I say anything on the internet, like every time I say like... People will
misunderstand you.
People try to misconstrue and misunderstand everything. Every time I say I like bananas, people are like, oh, so you hate strawberries. It's like, nah, no. Yeah. Or like, I have a cousin who's a strawberry. I think he's very disappointed by your comments about bananas. No, anyway. But there is like, what I see in yoga is also something I see in fascism, that there's like an idol or an icon. There is the guru, the one strong person, and they have a specific aesthetic, and that kind of like spills over or like bleeds into all his followers in some way.
Yeah, that you definitely copy it. And also this like this idea of like the you know, the guru and the person that you...
And everything they say is right, everything they say is true. It's not like, okay, this is my teacher, most of the things he does are good, but like his opinions on bananas or like his knowledge of agriculture is like really bad. So it's like this individual who's good at everything.
Yeah, everything this person says are words to live by. They're like my inspiration, and like they teach me like how to go through all aspects of life. And of course that's a very like dangerous position to have anyone in your life.
And I see the people like on Instagram, like influencers, that people look up to, they understand this, and they make themselves more aspirational because they know how this works, and they don't take on criticism because everything they do is right. So that's pretty problematic.
I would say generally having idols where you think that they can't do anything wrong and everything they say is something that you should try yourself, that is really not healthy. And if any kind of, you know, wellness or self-help person kind of gives you that vibe, then that's a red flag.
Interesting. Once I have to tell this story, I was at a physiotherapist, and I go in and he takes like his hand and he shoves it in my stomach.
What?
And there's a point to all of this. And then I say, why did you do that? And then he says like, I know more about this than you. You have consented to this treatment because you went in here, it means you consent, you've paid. And I'm like, what the fuck, bro? And then he says like, oh, you have period pains because it's not natural for women to have period pains because it's a natural process. And I went in there with like with shoulder issues, and he's like slamming his hand in my stomach. And then he says it shouldn't hurt, and then I say no matter which body part you slam your hand in, it probably hurts if you slam it hard enough. Doesn't mean there's anything wrong. He was like, no, it's because it's not natural. There's something wrong, or else it wouldn't hurt.
I've even seen like these male wellness influencers who are like, you know, women wouldn't bleed if their body was just a natural order and they ate the right things. You're like, I'm pretty sure, you know, menstruation is, you know, it's occurring in you know, most bodies with uterus. So but it's like this thing of, you know, telling people you should just do this, then your body will be more natural. And always like,
it's interesting because he was like, I'm right, I'm the which I mean, with his position and his job, he should know what he was doing, but he didn't. And then he also says like, it's because like you take drugs and drink alcohol, that's why you have period pain, which like I do none of those. So, and he was like, oh yes you do.
That.
No, he was like, oh yes you do, that's why it hurts. And it's like, why? And he was like very much like making himself this guru, would appeal to the
God.
natural. It was like, yeah, I cried.
It's terrible.
Like I cried.
It's terrible. I
after
hope
that,
he doesn't
and,
I hope nobody sees him.
I hope
It's
nobody
terrible.
sees him too. It was pretty terrible. Yeah, so I didn't go back, but I cried. I was like, I should try to explain this to him, but he wouldn't take any critique. He was right, so it just like reminded me.
Yeah. And I think that approach to, like, whether it's a bona fide doctor in a hospital or a physiotherapist or a yoga teacher, is just like so bad. And like I think something that a lot of women have experienced in many different types of setting. Like someone who'll talk over you and tell you like this is what's wrong, but not actually listening to you.
And I mean, sometimes they might be right, because sometimes people don't have any physical problems in and of itself, but they have anxiety. And instead of saying, oh, it's nothing, you're just nervous, they could say, okay, I think you have some anxiety issues. Go talk to a psychologist, or like it may feel bad but it's not bad, or like just explain very nicely, because people who don't know about medicine, they don't know about medicine, so you shouldn't use like medicine language. Maybe just like use more friendly, more how do you say, like a language that people can understand who haven't studied this.
Exactly, more approachable.
More approachable language. So a lot of what also brings people into these conspiracies is the visuality of it, the aesthetics of it all. It looks pretty. You want to look at it. It's kind of like something that's desirable. It's desirable to be a part of. Can you tell more about like pastel QAnon and the specific people who like promote this aesthetic?
Well, I think there are multiple aesthetics within QAnon. That's also why QAnon is so interesting, because it combines a lot of different groups. So you both have like the yoga, health, food aesthetic, where it's like mauve and pastel, and like the brown bags with the natural stuff in it, and like you look like you're not wearing makeup, but you're definitely wearing a lot of makeup. The clothes look like relaxed, but they're really expensive. And then you also have like the other part of QAnon, which is like Proud Boys and like fascist street thugs with big America flags and like skull masks, and you mix like those two aesthetics, kind of live next to each other, and maybe offer something for both, like the women who want to get into this movement, and the men who want to see themselves as kind of these freedom fighters who are fighting the corrupt government. Then the women are like freedom fighters who are protecting their kids against big pharma and like getting their body back into a natural state. So it's almost like somebody sat down with an ad agency and designed very kind of classic gendered aesthetics, right? This is how to get the men in, this is how to get the women in. Let's go. Yeah.
I see. Yeah. And it's hard, because like, I mean, some of these people that I've met, they're really, really nice, and I almost feel bad for thinking, oh, that's probably not true. But like, and then sometimes I meet like the science people who are just like not always really nice.
Yeah,
like
absolutely. And I think it's also important to say there are lots of people who do yoga and like a lot of like wellness training or a vegan or dietitians or whatever who are not like this. Like It's a huge community, so it's not everybody. I think it's like it's an environment where there is an increased likelihood of getting sucked into this, but it does not mean that everybody is like that.
Absolutely.
Like I know lots of people who are like doing yoga, training, teaching, who are not like this at all, and who like don't engage with it at all, or find it frustrating that this is happening in their communities as well. But I do think that definitely like science people, like both doctors and medical researchers, and a lot of the people who are working on researching some of the things that a lot of the conspiracies are about. So there could be conspiracies about the pandemic, but also conspiracies about 5G or all these things.
Just like there's a lot of conspiracies where I see at first they didn't believe in getting the shot, and after that like they didn't believe in like other stuff, and then in the end they don't believe in science at all.
Yeah, exactly. But I think a lot of scientists aren't making it easier for themselves, because there's also this tend to be a little bit arrogant if people don't know everything, and to be like oh well, you're stupid that you believe in this. And also like historically, scientists have been wrong, or science has been used for like for instance, for fascist ends, like phrenology and eugenics is one of the things. Like phrenology was like measuring the cranium and kind of
but
making
isn't that like
a race hierarchy. So it's like pseudoscience.
But
right?
it is a pseudoscience. It's not like a real.
No, but I mean, but who defines what the real science is? And I think that is actually a good discussion. For instance, a lot of the science around sex and gender research right now, some of it is, especially when it comes to trans people, for instance, is not very scientific. A lot of the kind of anti-trans science that is put out there is not properly done, but it is presented as serious science. And this is just like really important to know that you need to actually be able to understand the methodology of the science to see, okay, this is solid and this is peer reviewed, and you know, this is something where we can actually say with a certain certainty that this is the way it is. But especially science like sociology, or where you look at like, you know, big data sets of population statistics, that is very much influenced by who's looking, what data do they have available, how do they ask the questions. Like those are not like exact natural sciences, and how we look at the data and how we interpret it is very much influenced by our culture.
Yeah.
So I just think that is also really important to recognize.
It's an important like discussion, but it has to be a nuanced discussion.
Exactly.
You know, it's not like either for or against. And luckily, I'm happy sometimes the science is wrong, because it means that we get better and we know more and we know more. So something we thought was true like 20 years ago, maybe it's still true, but it's more nuanced than that. Maybe we know more than we knew 20 years ago. So the old data sets might seem wrong, or the old conclusions might seem wrong, but in reality we're just getting smarter and we know more, and that's good.
And I think often, and I know this from talking to a lot of like different researchers who say, well, often they find something and they're like, oh, this is interesting, but it doesn't, I can't like, you know, analyze this to mean anything big about society. But then a journalist gets their hands on it and like, oh, this is how it is. And the science is planning like, no, actually that's not what the study says. It's a very small data set. Or like, you know, scientists are forced to publish a lot and publish maybe sooner than they could say stuff. So I think our media environment, and especially our social media environment, also is fast to kind of run with scientific studies that are not as, you know, general as they're claimed to be then later. And that's not the fault of the scientists. That's the fault of the people like bringing it out into mainstream media a lot of the time.
Yeah. It's called publish or perish.
Really?
Yeah. Where you have to publish as much as possible, or else you will become irrelevant and you can't get cited, you can't get quoted. Yeah.
I mean, especially when it comes to health research, it's so important to get it right? So, for instance, in Denmark, the statistics showed during COVID, like, oh, people in you know, in low-income households get corona more often. So people were like, oh, it's the, you know, the social ghetto areas, and they're less, you know, they don't take care of each other as well, and they don't show, we called it samfundssind during the lockdown. So it's like you don't like show proper
regard for
society, but it's like, well, and as one of the health researchers said, could we like research how many people live in smaller apartments and which kind of jobs
and they often
these
have
people
service
have?
jobs where they're in contact with many people.
And
maybe you have a high-paying job, you have the luxury to stay at home and work alone. You know?
And you have a big house where you can be out in the garden to get some fresh air, but you don't have that when you live in a... So it's like that context, you can't just put out that health research and not be like, what's the context here? So that's also when, I mean, that often happens with scientific studies, that other people like extrapolate from them, whereas the researcher will say, well, we can only say this, and we like, in order to make big sweeping conclusions, we should also look at this and this and this.
So there are these researchers who have tried to explain in 4 words how conspiracy theories work. And they say that conspiracy theories are social, means that they're like in a social context and people affect each other. They're emotional because it's often an emotional reaction. They're universal because like it's a belief that can be spread across cultures and like social settings, and they're consequential, which is, I think, the worst part, is that they have real life consequence. And there's this theorem called the Thomas theorem, and Thomas here apparently says when people believe that something is true, they act like it is true. So it's easy to say, oh, they're just stupid, they shouldn't believe that, they shouldn't do this and that. But since these theories are consequential, And if we use the theorem, then it does mean that if I believe that bananas are evil, I will act as if bananas are evil, like in real life.
Yeah, and then you'll often get, your confirmation bias will then tell you that, it's good that you don't bring bananas home. You've been feeling much better because you don't have evil bananas in your home.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think it's also, one of my colleagues also pointed out something to me, who's doing a lot of research on conspiracy theories, that a lot of the belief in them tends to be more like better understood in terms of religion than in terms of science. So the belief for a lot of people who are in these communities is no longer about proof, but it's about belief, like believing in a deity or like a religious system, where it's not like, well, I don't need proof because I feel that it's true. So it's more akin to like, religious cults in the 70s, that we saw in the 70s, and also during the hippie time, like Bloom times, then it is about like misunderstanding facts. That is like less, you construe the facts to fit your narrative, but you believe in the narrative. And that's also, you can even show like people who are deep in some of these things, some statistics that disprove them, like, I don't believe that to be true. I believe this to be true, even though I don't have. So it's belief. It's and that is completely different talking to someone who's a believer in like a spiritual or religious system than somebody who's got their facts wrong.
Do you think the left-wing politics, politicians, people, communities, do you think they did something wrong for this to happen?
Well, I think first of all, there's a lot of like left-wing people who've gone down this pipeline.
But I see a lot of left-wing people going so far to the left that they're like end up at the right,
Yeah, but that's like, this is one of the, like, I don't believe in horseshoe theory generally, but this is one of the things where like the like some people on the left and the right actually converge, where it's because you have this like extreme like system critique, which is like sometimes so like conspirational. It's like, oh, that's the system, they're out to get you. It's like, well, the system is shit, but maybe not everything is thought out to like, for a specific end. Who has time for that? Nobody's got time for that. So there's definitely a thing there, but I think the more mainstream left has definitely miscalculated how much you can use like social media and these influencer tactics to influence people politically, and they're really, really late to the party.
Yeah, I noticed that in general the left wing is really, really late to the party with social media.
Yeah.
In general, maybe I feel like it's better in the US. Maybe it's because they have more people who knows they speak English.
But the old right in the US also precluded the left by miles. Like you have some big like influencers who are really good at it and so on, and streamers, but there are so many, many more on the right. But that also has to do with funding. Like a lot of like old right influencers, for instance, they get paid to do this kind of thing. Like they're part of news networks, or they're funded by some like think tank or something like that. So we also don't have that kind of funding available on the left. So I think that's also important. Like you can't sit all day around and do content for free. You need some sort of income to live. And we don't have those kind of like big funding entities on the left from businesses or media moguls who want to keep the status quo.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, I noticed that a lot in Denmark, but it's just like what I've seen. A lot of left-wing groups, they tend to work in the more traditional realms, more like person to person, instead of going out social media and reaching like millions of people at the same time.
And I think like the organizing in your community is great, and that's where a lot of these right-wing influences will fall through, because then when they actually hit the street, they don't have the kind of support they're looking for. But I think in terms of combating misinformation and picking up some of these people who are going down these pipelines, I think the left is missing out, and they should like get on it.
Definitely, they should. Thank you for listening. This was the episode about the pipeline from yoga to conspiracy theories. This is Maia, and where can people find you?
Well, you can find me on Instagram. I'm called Maia the Cyber Witch, but I mostly do content in Danish. You can also find me on the Fediverse or Mastodon, which is a open source Twitter alternative. And I reside on the server called helvede.net, which I'm also moderating. Yeah, so most people know it as Mastodon, which is some software that connects like a lot of different servers all over the globe. So it's basically, imagine it's a bit like Twitter, but instead of my data being owned now by Elon Musk and maybe it'll shut down in a few weeks, I have my own data on my own server. And when I write, people can connect with me all over the globe, but they also run their own servers. So if, for instance, if I find somebody on a server where I'm like, oh, that they are fascists, then I'll just block them. And then they can't talk to me or my users. So it's much more like user generated and user moderated. And huge, like there's lots of
nice.
fun
I had no
weird
idea what that
spaces.
was. So instead of Elon, we get you on the Fediverse.
Yes, and a lot of other people in
And
there.
a lot
So
of
a lot of like
personalized
really fun, also a lot of like trash people, of course, but you have a much better like control, and you can block them yourself easier on the Fediverse.
Yeah, and you don't have to pay $8 to get a
No,
trademark.
absolutely not. Yeah.
Okay then. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And tune in next time for something I don't know what it is yet. Bye.
Bye.